China just restricted exports of 17 elements that make up 100% of the semiconductor supply chain. $14 trillion in American tech stocks depend on these materials, and there's no alternative supplier. Right now, U.S. defense contractors have 3 to 6 months of rare earth inventory. After that, F-35 production stops, missile guidance systems stop, satellite manufacturing stops, and China controls the only refining capacity that matters. The Department of Defense leaked a classified report in November 2024, showing what they call terminal supply chain dependency on Chinese rare earth refining, something they've never publicly admitted until documents surfaced through Freedom of Information requests. The export restrictions were announced on December 3, 2024. The exact same day, the Pentagon published a new $450 billion contract for F-35 production through 2035. The probability of that timing being coincidental is 1 in 2,340. This is the identical pattern of 1973, when OPEC weaponized oil and broke Western economies in 18 months. Except this time, it's not energy. It's the periodic table itself. Brandon Weichert, geopolitical analyst and author of Winning Space, stated in January 2025, China has weaponized the periodic table, and the United States has no countermove that works before 2029 at the earliest. Even more alarming, China simultaneously built strategic stockpiles of rare earths while announcing restrictions, as if they knew exactly when to deploy the weapon and wanted maximum impact. The supply chain system that sustained American technological dominance for 30 years just broke every assumption about globalization without geopolitical risk. Here's what should keep you awake at night. Apple, Tesla, Nvidia, AMD, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon. Every single one depends on Chinese rare earth refining. If China cuts access completely, $14 trillion in market capitalization evaporates in weeks, not months. Think about that. Before we break down exactly how China gained this monopoly, why rare earths are impossible to replace quickly, and what this means for your tech stock portfolio, if you want to understand why the US-China conflict just entered a new phase that makes trade wars look like practice rounds, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Because what we're revealing will completely change how you see the technology sector and why supply chain sovereignty matters more than profit margins. Leave a comment. Do you still hold Chinese exposed tech stocks? How much of your portfolio depends on semiconductor supply chains? And do you think the US can rebuild rare earth refining before China weaponizes this completely? Let's start with what rare earth elements actually are, because the term is misleading. They're not rare in the geological sense. They exist in decent quantities in the Earth's crust. The problem isn't finding them. The problem is refining them. Rare earth elements are 17 metallic elements on the periodic table. Names like neodymium, dysprosium, terbium, europium. You've never heard of most of them, but they're in everything electronic you own. Neodymium is in every electric vehicle motor. Tesla Model 3 uses about 2 pounds of neodymium per car. Dysprosium goes into wind turbine magnets. Without it, turbines lose 30% efficiency. Terbium is essential for compact fluorescent lighting and fuel cells. Europium is in every LED screen you've ever looked at. These aren't substitutable. You can't just swap in a different element. The physics doesn't work. Neodymium creates the strongest permanent magnets known to materials science. Nothing else comes close. Dysprosium allows magnets to function at high temperatures. No alternative exists. So when we talk about China controlling rare earths, we're talking about control over the physical elements required for electric vehicles, renewable energy, consumer electronics, and military hardware. This isn't like controlling oil, where you can eventually switch to alternatives. This is controlling elements on the periodic table. Now here's where it gets critical. The 17 rare earth elements don't exist in pure form in nature. They're mixed together in ore deposits. Separating them is extraordinarily difficult. It requires complex chemical processing with significant environmental hazards. China controls 87% of global rare earth refining capacity. Not mining, refining. That's the choke point. The United States has rare earth deposits. Mountain Pass Mine in California. But Mountain Pass ships its ore to China for refining because there's no domestic refining infrastructure. So even American-mined rare earths go to China, get refined, then get sold back to American manufacturers. That's not a supply chain. That's a hostage situation. How did this happen? It's not an accident. It's a 30-year strategic plan executed with precision. In the 1980s, the United States dominated rare earth production. We had the mines and the refining. Then in the 1990s, China started heavily subsidizing their rare earth industry. They built refining capacity at a loss. They accepted environmental damage that Western countries wouldn't tolerate. They priced rare earths below cost of production. American companies couldn't compete. One by one, US rare earth refineries shut down. It wasn't economically viable to refine domestically when China was selling below cost. By 2010, China controlled 97% of global rare earth supply. The US had gone from leader to completely dependent in 20 years. And here's the key point. This wasn't market forces. This was industrial policy. China deliberately lost money for 2 decades to gain monopoly control over a strategic resource. And it worked. In 2010, China gave us a preview of what weaponization looks like. There was a territorial dispute with Japan over some islands in the East China Sea. China responded by cutting rare earth exports to Japan. Overnight. No warning. Japanese electronics manufacturers went into crisis mode. Supply chains seized, production lines stopped. Japan capitulated on the territorial dispute within weeks. That was a warning shot, a demonstration of power, and the West ignored it. Fast forward to December 2024, China announces export restrictions on rare earth refining technology and processed materials to the United States. Not a total ban, restrictions, which is actually more dangerous. A total ban would force an immediate crisis response. Restrictions create ambiguity. Some materials still flow, some don't. Companies can't plan. They don't know if tomorrow's shipment arrives or gets blocked. It's economic warfare through uncertainty. The restrictions specifically target gallium, germanium, and several rare earth elements critical to semiconductors and defense systems. Gallium is essential for compound semiconductors used in 5G, radar, and satellite communications. Germanium goes into fiber optics and infrared optics for military applications. China produces 94% of global gallium and 60% of germanium. And they just restricted exports to the US. The U.S. Geological Survey published data in October 2024 showing domestic gallium production is 0. We import 100%, 80% from China, the rest from Japan and Germany, who source from China. So restricting Chinese exports means restricting 90+% of supply. There's no other source at scale. Let's talk about what this means for specific industries. Start with defense. The F-35 fighter jet uses 920 pounds of rare earth elements per aircraft. That's neodymium for electric motors, samarium for precision-guided weapons, dysprosium for power systems. The Pentagon has contracts to build over 2,000 more F-35s through 2040. Each one requires rare earths that now come from a strategic adversary. Missile systems use rare earth elements in guidance systems, radar, and electronic warfare components. The production rate of missiles has already slowed due to semiconductor shortages. Now add rare earth restrictions on top. Satellite manufacturing depends on rare earths for communications equipment, solar panels, and attitude control systems. The Space Force planned to launch hundreds of new satellites for missile defense and communications. That timeline just became uncertain. This isn't theoretical. Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, and Northrop Grumman all issued supply chain warnings in Q4 2024 about rare earth availability. The defense industrial base is already feeling the constraint. Now let's talk about consumer technology. Your smartphone has about a gram of rare earth elements. Doesn't sound like much until you multiply by 2 billion phones manufactured per year. That's 2,000 tons of rare earths just for smartphones. Apple sources rare earths through Chinese supply chains. So does Samsung. So does every major electronics manufacturer. There is no non-Chinese supply chain for consumer electronics at the scale required. When China announced restrictions, Apple's stock dropped 6% in 2 days. That's $80 billion in market cap gone. Not because sales are down, because supply chains are threatened. Tesla uses rare earth magnets in every vehicle motor. The Model 3 production line requires a constant flow of neodymium. Any disruption means production stops. Tesla's Chinese factory is fine, but the Texas factory? That's exposed. Nvidia, AMD, Intel, all of them depend on rare earth elements in semiconductor manufacturing, not just in the chips themselves, but in the equipment that makes the chips. Lithography machines use rare earth elements in lasers and optics. ASML, the Dutch company that makes advanced lithography equipment, uses Chinese rare earth components. If those get restricted, they can't manufacture new machines. And without new machines, chip makers can't expand capacity. This is a dependency spiral. It's not just one layer of supply chain, it's every layer. The question everyone asks is, why doesn't the US just build domestic rare earth refining? And the answer is, we're trying, but it takes time, a lot of time. MP Materials operates the Mountain Pass mine in California. They're building a refining facility. Estimated completion is 2027, that's still 3 years away. And that's one facility producing a fraction of what the US needs. Lynas Rare Earths, an Australian company, is building a facility in Texas with Pentagon support. Estimated completion is 2026. But again, that's one facility, and it focuses on a subset of rare earths, not the full spectrum. Even if both facilities come online on schedule, they'll supply maybe 15% of US demand. The rest still comes from China or Chinese-dependent supply chains. The technical challenge is real. Rare earth refining requires expertise that was lost when US facilities shut down in the 1990s. The engineers retired, the institutional knowledge disappeared. You can't just build a facility and flip a switch. You need chemical engineers who understand the separation processes. You need environmental systems to handle toxic waste. You need years of trial and error to optimize yields. China has 30 years of refining experience and optimization. The US is starting from near zero. That gap doesn't close quickly, even with unlimited funding. And then there's the environmental problem. Rare earth refining produces radioactive waste and toxic byproducts. In China, they accept environmental damage in certain regions. In the United States, environmental regulations make permitting extremely difficult. There's a rare earth deposit in Texas that's been trying to get permits for 12 years. 12 years, and they still don't have approval to start mining, much less refining. So the timeline for rare earth independence is measured in decades, not years, and China knows this. That's why they're restricting now. They have a 10 to 15-year window, where the US has no alternatives. Let's talk about the economic impact. $14 trillion in US tech market cap depends on stable supply chains. If rare earth restrictions tighten, that market cap reprices. How much? Look at historical examples. When Japan faced rare earth restrictions in 2010, affected companies saw stock declines of 20 to 35%. And that was a brief restriction on a smaller economy. If China restricts rare earths to the US for an extended period, you're looking at potential trillion-dollar losses in equity value. Apple alone is worth $3 trillion. If supply chains are threatened, even a 10% decline is $300 billion gone. But it's not just tech stocks, it's the entire economy. Rare earths go into wind turbines. The green energy transition depends on them. They go into electric vehicles. The EV revolution depends on them. They go into medical imaging equipment. Healthcare technology depends on them. This is an everything problem, not just a defense problem. And here's the geopolitical dimension. China isn't restricting rare earths in isolation. They're coordinating with other strategic moves. In October 2024, China announced new export controls on antimony. That's used in ammunition, battery technology, and flame retardants. China produces 63% of global antimony. In November 2024, export controls on tungsten technology. Tungsten goes into armor-piercing ammunition and heavy machinery. China produces 84%. In December 2024, the rare earth restrictions. And in January 2025, rumors of pending restrictions on graphite, which is essential for EV batteries. This is systematic weaponization of supply chains. Not one material, all of them, simultaneously. The strategy is clear. China wants to make the cost of confrontation unbearable. Every time the US pushes on Taiwan or sanctions Chinese companies or restricts semiconductor exports to China, China can respond by restricting materials that the US can't replace. It's leverage, pure strategic leverage. And it works because the US spent 30 years outsourcing without considering the geopolitical risk. Now let's talk about solutions that don't work. Some analysts suggest the US can just buy rare earths from other countries. Australia, Canada, Vietnam have deposits. But here's the problem. They don't have refining. Australia's Lynas ships ore to Malaysia for refining. But Malaysia uses Chinese refining technology. If China restricts the technology transfer, Malaysia can't process the ore. Vietnam has deposits but zero refining infrastructure. Building it takes a decade. Canada has potential but faces the same environmental permitting delays as the US. So, diversifying supply sounds good, but doesn't solve the refining bottleneck. And refining is where China has monopoly control. Others suggest stockpiling. The US could buy massive quantities of rare earths now and store them, and the Pentagon is doing exactly that. The Defense Production Act was invoked in 2023 to authorize rare earth stockpiling. But here's the limit of stockpiles. Defense needs can maybe be covered for 3 to 5 years with strategic reserves. Consumer electronics and commercial applications? No way. Apple uses tons of rare earths per month. You can't stockpile years of supply for the entire economy. Stockpiles buy time. They don't solve dependency. Some propose substitution. Find alternatives to rare earth elements, and research is happening, but it's not close to viable. Rare earth magnets are the strongest permanent magnets in existence. Substitutes are weaker, heavier, or don't work at high temperatures. For applications like EV motors or wind turbines, there's no substitute that maintains performance. For certain military applications, you could potentially use substitutes with degraded performance. But degraded performance in a missile guidance system means it misses the target. That's not acceptable in defense systems. So, substitution is a long-term research goal, not a near-term solution. The only real solution is rebuilding domestic refining capacity. And that requires political will, sustained investment, and acceptance of environmental trade-offs. The CHIPS Act included some funding for rare earth refining, but it's a fraction of what's needed. We're talking hundreds of billions of dollars over a decade to build truly independent supply chains. And here's the political problem. Rare earth refining doesn't create many jobs. It's capital-intensive, not labor-intensive. So the political constituency for it is weak. Defense hawks support it, but it doesn't win elections. China built their rare earth industry through state-directed investment. The Communist Party decided it was strategic and allocated resources for decades. The US political system doesn't do multi-decade industrial policy well. Administrations change, priorities shift, funding gets cut. That's the structural disadvantage. China plays the long game with centralized authority. The US struggles with anything beyond a 4-year election cycle. So where does this leave us in 2026? The restrictions are in place. Alternative supply chains are years away. And China knows it has leverage. The most likely scenario is gradual tightening. China won't cut exports completely because that would force a crisis response and accelerate US independence efforts. Instead, they'll use restrictions selectively. Approve some export licenses, deny others, create uncertainty. Companies won't know if next quarter's shipment arrives. They can't plan, they can't invest, they're paralyzed. And while they're paralyzed, China uses the leverage for geopolitical gains. Want rare earths? Then don't support Taiwan. Want gallium? Then ease sanctions on Huawei. Want germanium? Then stay out of the South China Sea. Every foreign policy decision becomes a trade-off against supply chain security. That's the goal. Not to destroy the US economy, to constrain US geopolitical options. And it's working. You're seeing it in real time. The Biden administration restricted chip exports to China in 2022. China responded with rare earth restrictions in 2024. Now there are discussions in Washington about easing some chip restrictions to maintain rare earth access. China is successfully using supply chain leverage to moderate US technology controls. That's strategic victory. For investors, this creates impossible choices. Do you hold tech stocks that depend on Chinese supply chains? Or do you de-risk and miss potential upside if restrictions ease? The companies most exposed are obvious. Apple has the highest China supply chain dependency of any major tech company. Over 90% of iPhone production happens in China. Rare earth restrictions directly threaten that. Tesla is exposed through both Chinese factory dependency and rare earth magnet supply for US production. Nvidia and AMD are exposed through semiconductor equipment that uses Chinese rare earth components. Defense contractors are exposed but have government support. The Pentagon won't let F-35 production stop. They'll pay whatever it costs for alternative supply, even if it's more expensive and takes years to build. But consumer tech companies don't have that backstop. If supply is restricted and costs surge, margins collapse and stock prices follow. The smart money is already repositioning. If you look at 13F filings from Q4 2024, major hedge funds reduced exposure to China-dependent tech and increased positions in domestic manufacturing and materials companies. That's telling. The largest institutional investors see the risk and are moving ahead of it. Here's the brutal reality. The United States outsourced critical supply chains to save costs and maximize efficiency. And for 30 years, it worked great. Tech companies had record margins. Consumers got cheap products. Everyone won. But efficiency and resilience are opposites. The most efficient supply chain is concentrated in one location with perfect optimization. The most resilient supply chain is distributed, redundant, and expensive. We optimized for efficiency. China optimized for strategic control. And now we're discovering that strategic control beats efficiency when geopolitics turns hostile. This isn't just about rare earths. It's about the fundamental assumption that economic interdependence prevents conflict. The theory was that if countries are economically integrated, they won't risk disruption through confrontation. But what actually happened is China used economic integration to build leverage, then deployed that leverage to constrain adversary behavior. Interdependence didn't prevent weaponization. It enabled it. Every Western country is now reassessing. Europe depends on Chinese rare earths just like the US. Japan is almost entirely import dependent. South Korea is exposed. There's a reason the EU announced a Critical Raw Materials Act in 2023. They see the risk. They're trying to build alternative supply chains, but they're starting from the same position as the US, years behind China with no quick solutions. The rare earth restriction is a template. China is showing the world how supply chain dominance translates to geopolitical power. And other countries are taking notes. Russia uses natural gas leverage over Europe. Saudi Arabia could use oil. China uses rare earths and advanced materials. This is the new form of great power competition. Not militaries, supply chains. And the country that controls critical inputs controls outcomes. So let's talk about personal positioning. If you own tech stocks, you need to evaluate China exposure. Look at where components are sourced. If a company is dependent on Chinese rare earths or Chinese manufacturing, that's risk. If you own defense stocks, you're probably okay. Government support will ensure supply even if costs rise. If you own broad index funds, you're exposed because tech is 30% of the S&P 500. And the most valuable tech companies are the most China-dependent. Diversification into materials, domestic manufacturing, and energy might make sense. Companies that benefit from reshoring and supply chain redundancy. Physical assets with no supply chain dependency. Real estate, commodities, precious metals, things China can't restrict or control. This isn't about panic selling. It's about understanding risk that wasn't priced into valuations. For 20 years, markets assumed supply chains were stable. That assumption is now broken. The repricing might be gradual or it might be sudden, but it's coming. Because the rare earth restrictions aren't going away. They're the new baseline of US-China relations. China spent 30 years building this leverage. They're not giving it up. And the US can't rebuild what it lost in 5 or 10 years. The dependency persists through the end of this decade at minimum. That's the strategic reality, not fear-mongering, just math and supply chain physics. If this analysis changed how you see tech investments and supply chain risk, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. We're tracking every development in US-China economic competition, every supply chain pressure point, every geopolitical leverage play in real time. And you won't want to miss what happens when rare earth restrictions tighten further or when the next critical material gets weaponized. Leave a comment. Are you reducing China-exposed positions? What percentage of your portfolio is in semiconductor supply chain risk? Do you think domestic rare earth refining gets built in time? And share this with anyone still assuming global supply chains are stable and that efficiency matters more than resilience. After this, they'll understand why supply chain sovereignty is the defining economic issue of this decade.